Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. Each episode has its own accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The Gestalt Get Together is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt language processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the frameworks of GLP and NLA. I'm Corinne Smoose, MS, CCC, SLP, a musical language therapist who's dedicated to celebrating while investigating Gestalt language processing, protecting the scientific method, and reducing cognitive linguistic biases about this framework and these clients that I love so much. My areas of focus are psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in GLPs. Previously, I worked closely with key players in the GLP quote-unquote movement, but experienced concerns with the propensity for logical fallacies and resistance to quantitative inquiry in the larger community. I now identify myself as lovingly skeptical, and I hope that listeners will sharpen their ability to recognize linguistic choices that move a cause forward without strong evidence, what level of evidence we're actually dealing with, and where we need to go next to support these kids that we care about. So what can you expect from us? Our episodes will provide balanced and educational interviews about clinician experiences, live coaching and problem solving about therapeutic decision making with a healthy dose of musical language recommendations thrown in, discussions on the logical fallacies and cognitive biases that emerge when implementing a new approach, and even some elements of the BITE model that have emerged within the larger GLP movement. Most importantly, this podcast is intended to help you embrace, investigate, and analyze your unique role in child development for Gestalt language processors without getting in your own way. This podcast is a celebration of neurodivergent learning, and we look forward to you learning with us along the way. Welcome to today's course entitled Rhythmic Entrainment as a Critical Component of Language Intervention for Autistic Children. This is an episode of the Gestalt Get Together, which is a podcast hosted by SpeechTherapyPD.com, all about Gestalt language processing, the framework, the ideas behind it, where to look next in acquiring evidence. And I'm really excited to talk about one of my favorite topics today, which is the idea of entrainment. This episode is offered for 0.1 ASHA CEUs, and if you are listening later through just audio, make sure that you log on to SpeechTherapyPD.com to find out how you can get credit for all of your hard work today, listening in and learning. So here's what we're going to do next. We are going to dive in and talk about one of these great topics. A lot of you might be here because you work with autistic children. You want to build your toolbox for how to support them. And you probably also have some clients who are highly musical, but you might not be sure what quite to do with that. First, I want to give my financial disclosures. You can read them below. And I also want to share some of these outcomes of today's episode. First, I'd love for you to be able to come away with this, being able to define rhythmic entrainment. I'd also love if you can come away from this episode understanding how individuals rhythmically entrain to one another, and that includes you, across at least 3 social contexts. I would love for you to be able to outline at least 3 brain-based differences where autistic individuals may experience the passage of time differently than neurotypical brains. And yeah, time, passing, and rhythm are highly intertwined. I'd love for you to be able to list and describe at least 5 strategies for rhythmically entraining to your autistic client. And I'd love for you to be able to describe a bit how not being entrained to a client may hinder social communication and language acquisition. This last one might be appropriate for those kids on your caseload who feel really hard to work with. Maybe you're not feeling as entrained to them, or they're not feeling as entrained to you. But we got to get some definitions out of the way. What is rhythm? Rhythm is something that we all feel, but it might be hard to describe. In music, rhythm refers to the patterns and the relationships of sounds and silences as time passes. The sounds and the silences are equally important. And you might also argue it's the same for language input. If I just talk like this really fast, there's no silence there. It's really hard to parse out meaning from a string of information without meaningful pauses. Now, rhythm is a fundamental element that gives music and language temporal structure. When we use the word temporal, we're talking about the passage of time. Rhythm helps guide listeners through a sequence of information, and it helps us in the present moment, the part of the rhythm we're hearing, understand what has already happened and what might come next. Now, rhythm exists outside of music. We feel it and we use it. When we eat, our chewing has rhythm. When we have conversations, when you're talking to someone and you just click, like boom, boom, boom. Sports, we definitely need rhythm for that. When we teach, right now, I'm trying to pace my rhythm accordingly. When we fight with rhythm. When we flirt with rhythm. Driving, we better have good rhythm when we're driving. And even navigating public spaces. Rhythm is critical for almost everything we do, especially as social beings. What I want you to do now as a listener is think of one area of your life that you use your rhythmic skills. But another important term I want to share is tempo. Tempo is the speed or pace that a rhythm goes at. Music might have a fast tempo like this, ba, 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 ba. Or music may have a slow tempo like this. The tempo sets the feeling for music. It impacts a listener's mood, energy, connection to the piece, and even the interaction with other people who are listening to that same piece of music. And choosing tempo is a crucial aspect of musical expression. I'm also going to argue this for language. The tempo or the speed at which we talk impacts mood, energy, connection to the speaker, and how everyone in a room might be feeling. If I were doing the podcast like this at a slow tempo, you may not feel as engaged with the content. Now, others of you might feel that my tempo is a bit too fast for you. I can't help it. I'm a New Yorker. It comes with the territory. Tempo is truly everywhere, even when it's not carefully selected as it is in music. We feel tempo in conversations, when we're exercising, when we're disagreeing, that chemistry you feel with a new friend or someone you might have a crush on, the safety of drivers on a highway, so much more. The speed or pace of our rhythmic actions impacts our entire quality of life. Now I want you to think about a routine in your life that you notice tempo. I know for me, I brush my teeth with such a fast tempo that the bristles go like this. The tempo of how I brush my teeth is an area I would want to make changes around for my gum health, as well as for my toothbrushes to last a little longer. So I want you to think about tempo, a place in your life where you could shift tempo. And if you're here, you're probably wanting an idea for how to use this with your clients. So let's get to the big definition. This is the first outcome I want you to come away with. What is rhythmic entrainment? Entrainment is a biomusicological phenomena. I love that phrase, a biomusicological phenomena that describes an organism's ability. You're an organism, I'm one too, all your clients, they are the cutest organisms we've ever met. It's our ability to synchronize our internal rhythms to perceived external rhythms. We are impacted by the rhythms all around us. Our bodies make changes to adapt to those, to synchronize, and other people change their rhythms to match ours. This function, if we're thinking about it from an evolutionary standpoint, which I love to do, I always want to position myself to think about, why do humans have this? Linguistic anthropologists and musicologists, some of the claims are that it stems from evolutionary benefits for group survival. If we're entrained to one another, we're more likely to go into battle or to deal with a sense of danger better. It helps with group cohesion if we're entrained to one another, if our internal rhythms match the greater group. It also helps with communication. Think about that coworker you have where your conversation just flows. You guys are really entrained to each other. You're more efficient at communicating. Now, entrainment can occur with auditory rhythms and visual rhythms. In musical language therapy, which is the program that I design and I talk about for integrating all these ideas, we use both of these things to build meaning for clients. We don't just rely on auditory, we don't just rely on visual rhythms, we bring them both together. So I wanted to present you with some research that I find to be helpful in laying the groundwork for what entrainment can do for us and why. It's not just knowing the techniques, it's also being able to ground your practice in theory and explain that to other people in this child's life. A lot of people hear the idea of using music in speech therapy and they're like, okay, yeah, wheels on the bus. Yeah, music is great. But if you can give some of that science, you're more likely to get buy-in, especially from people who may have some older ways of approaching the clients that you're working with, or who aren't really engaging in a neurodiversity affirming paradigm yet. So when people make music, dance, or engage in conversation, they participate in something called joint action. Joint action is a shared sense of rhythmic timing, and it's also a shared affective state. When you're engaged in joint action with someone, you're not only tuned into each other's movement patterns and the sense of time passing, you're also more likely to have a shared emotion or very similar emotions to one another. For example, I was just helping a friend move a giant couch up a spiral staircase in a very old building. We were engaging in rhythmic timing to make sure we were doing the steps at the same time. And this joint action also meant we were sharing affective state. There were moments on that spiral staircase where we were both laughing at how ridiculous we felt, but we were also able to attune to each other and entrain to each other when we needed a break because we noticed the facial expressions changing. Now, many of our long-term goals for our clients are examples of joint action. I want you to think about a goal for one of your clients and think about, is there joint action needed for that client to accomplish that? Whether that's conversation turn taking, if it's being able to engage with peers in a new way, do they have to shift their timing to match up with an affective state to accomplish a shared goal? So what this means is that people engaged in true joint action are temporally entrained as well as emotionally entrained. Without joint action, complex exchanges of information can fall short. We know that communication is a complex exchange of information. My favorite example is like a first date when things just click. And some of you might not have gone on a first date in quite a while, but think back to those feelings. On a great first date, you might be mirroring each other's body movements. The conversation feels like a flow or a dance, and you're completely in the moment. You're not searching your brain for what to do or say next. There's this sense of shared affect or emotion between you. You might even say to your friend after, it just feels so easy with them. That's entrainment. You might have a friend it feels like that with, or a coworker. Now think of an awkward business meeting or team meeting or IEP meeting. It feels like the timing is clunky. There's a discomfort from mismatched affects. Your brain is working so much harder to participate when you don't feel entrained to other people. So joint action actually emerges very early in life, and it's first characterized by that affective entrainment between infants and their parents or their caregivers. Now, a significant part of parent-infant interaction is actually musical in nature. Think about how many people naturally speak to babies. Oh my goodness, aren't you just so cute? Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's pretty musical. And it's evident in those qualities of slower tempo, repetition, exaggerated prosody, and then parent movements that match up. The eyes widen, the head nods. We don't see this flat expression while providing this musical auditory output. All of these features serve as what they call a coordination enhancer. These are all kind of forcing functions acoustically that help with that flow of information back and forth. They engage attention, they promote emotional communication. Now, when infants start to respond to those musical characteristics, we call this now communicative musicality. It builds an infant's ability, and this is important, to predict the timing of parent expressions and utterances. It also builds their ability to produce responses that are somewhat
coordinated in terms of timing. These are the first examples of conversations. So some things for you to think about. How can you think of how these early processing and prediction skills for infants inform later language development? And can you think about how limited coordinated musicality or lower quality communicative musicality experiences could impact later language development? For the autistic clients we work with, the actual structural and functional differences of the brain might be able to account for these differences and the challenges later with predictive timing. So there are two main types of entrainment I'd love for you to come away with this with. I'm giving lots of repetitions so that's easier to remember. There's temporal entrainment and affective. Timing and predictive skills are a big deal for social language. Temporal coordination is a form of interpersonal contingency. What I do depends on what you do, depended on what I did, depended on what you did. It's this back and forth. When infants and children are able to predict behavioral timing patterns of one another, it reduces the time lags in processing. If we're engaged in meaningful prediction, our brain has to do less to process what's coming next. And we consider this pretty essential for bonding. A common game for this is actually peekaboo. And it allows you the predictability of the general game, but there's gentle timing violations. Each time you play, that caregiver waits a little bit shorter, a little bit longer. And for a child, those differences that might seem so small to us are really meaningful information for that child. So temporal entrainment is when you modify your own movements or your thoughts to match that external stimulus, like music or actions from another person. And you might see this in music with head nodding or toe tapping. And this might be something you don't even realize that you're head bobbing or tapping to a song you're listening to. With social interactions, you may find yourself mirroring the other person's posture. You might start to gesture like they do. And if you're anything like me, you might start to shift your dialect a little bit or your accent to entrain to another person who might be talking. So high levels of temporal entrainment, you see these in like group dances. And low levels of temporal entrainment might be when you're walking next to someone and your footsteps start to line up. You're trying to entrain to them. Now, the other side, as I've mentioned, is affective entrainment. And that's that feeling or that shared feeling between individuals. And, that's what we're trying to do with our clients is get that connection, that trust. It involves creating these interpersonal bonds, sharing emotion, and that happens once there's temporal entrainment of some kind. This is linked to that joy you feel, the connection, that trust when you're moving your body similarly to someone else. And actually, this is what can help with a feeling of groove, and cracks me up that groove is actually a scientific term that people try to study. And that's that pleasurable movement happens with music that has a little bit of unexpected element in it. Now, temporal and affective dimensions of entrainment, they're pretty intertwined. The level of synchronization in terms of movement with a client or a friend or anyone, how synchronized you are, can actually predict the intensity of the groove and shared emotion. So what I want you to do is think about an activity where you feel emotionally entrained to other people or the larger external stimulus. Are you also entraining in your movements? I'm going to give some examples, and I would love to know if any of these are a place where you feel affective entrainment to the people around you. A group dance class, a yoga class. These are places where I feel like I am part of something bigger than myself. Maybe religious worship, if that's part of your identity in your life. Being in a crowd at a game, like a baseball game. Watching a comedy show. I know for me, how loud I laugh is usually entrained to how loud other people are laughing. Or listening to an orchestra. I'm so curious if any of those are areas where you feel affective entrainment to others. Now, if we're talking about the autistic neurotype, it's really important to know about structural differences. So developmental abnormalities in the autistic neurotype, we see a lot of them in the brainstem and the cerebellum. And we see these abnormalities showing up in prenatal stages, which can lead to deficits or differences in sensory perception, which we know is one of the biggest indicators and areas to support with our autistic clients. Now, rhythm is truly the organization of the passage of time into distinct patterns. And so if we think about if there is reduced ability to process and perceive rhythm in the world, especially when it comes to linguistic rhythm, which is kind of hard to predict, there's also a reduced ability to perceive the passage of time and a sequence of movement patterns within that passage of time. It could have wide-ranging impacts on development. Less organized rhythm and that sense of synchronization in infants can be an early sign of the autistic neurotype that can help us support families into receiving the right services earlier in life. So perception and production of rhythm, these are connected to cortical brain networks and subcortical. In my work, I primarily research auditory brainstem and the auditory cortices, and so subcortical and cortical. Now, one of the most impressive abilities of the auditory system is the speed and precision with which it detects temporal patterns in incoming signals. Temporal patterns in incoming signals. Temporal patterns in incoming signals. I tried to make my incoming signal a little more patterned for you as time passed. If these systems are developing atypically, and we know that in the autistic neurotype, the auditory brainstem is quite different, the perception and the response to acoustic patterns and timing in speech will likely be impacted. In the autistic neurotype, we see differences in short-range connections and long-range connections in the brain. And there are claims that these impairments or differences in long-range networks, which are between different structures and hemispheres, are major contributors to the social, emotional, and communication differences associated with autistic processing. And this includes auditory brainstem to auditory cortex. That's one of those long-range connections that may be more challenging. So my claim is that we can use music to help strengthen that connection upwards. Now, musical entrainment as a whole, it requires a big network in body and brain. We need auditory information, visual, haptic, proprio, vestibular. All of these things can help with musical entrainment. It requires motor synchronization, attention, execution, feedback, coordination. This is a big ask of a little body. Rhythmic entrainment isn't just for us, though. Rhythmic entrainment has this really powerful ability to connect an autistic individual with their own natural body rhythms, as well as non-verbally connect them to us. These approaches, they really honor and kind of celebrate the client's rhythms right at, in the moment, meeting them where they are and what their rhythms are, rather than immediately trying to push them to conform to the rhythms of others. And I'm sure you've seen, just like me, the effect it can have when you are pushing an autistic child to try and match up with others' rhythms when they may not even be connected with their own yet. So some musical interventions that may be able to stimulate speech, motor, and language networks in autistic individuals, just as a broad brush, it could be synchronizing musical elements. For example, if they are singing a certain melody, you could synchronize the musical elements of your voice and sing along. You could do the next line. You could do an improvised version where you change the lyrics. That's the synchronizing of musical elements. You could also entrain to rhythmic vocalizations. And so you might think about if a child is stimming vocally, like I might entrain to that myself. You might also entrain to them through bimanual motor actions. For example, if they're lining things up, you might line it up to the same rhythm. And rhythm is really helpful for motor tasks like speech. And we can connect this back to the cerebellum. There is a central rhythm in everyone's cerebellum, and this rhythm is often atypical in the autistic neurotype. Musically driven speech and language therapy might be able to promote a natural rhythmicity at the point of the cerebellum and support an organization or reorganization of the cerebellar circuits. So this is a paper I highly recommend looking into. It's by Pat Amos, 2013. It's called Rhythm and Timing in Autism, Learning to Dance. It's not a quantitative work. It's not a heavy research paper. It's more like a very lovely look into what autism may feel like for an autistic individual. And when we think about the nervous system and how it supports, how music and the nervous system can support learning and connection. Think about your body right now. Every single millisecond, innumerable body data points are constantly adjusted through this endless stream of internal and external motion and sensory input. It is so much your body and brain are doing. This flow of information moves in two directions, central to peripheral, peripheral to central. And for some bodies and brains, these signals move smoothly. They make sense from sender to receiver. It is a smooth dance. But for many neurodivergent individuals, these signals can be more challenging. They can be inconsistent. They can feel hard to interpret. Some of them may be more meaningful and lead to some of those amazing strengths we see in our clients. But that mistiming of signals can lead to a lot of challenges too. And this may show you and help to explain why all of your clients may have the same diagnostic category, but present so differently. The timing differences in their bodies and brains might be moving at different paces or have different points that are more challenging for them. So with timing, and it's not just the timing we can consciously perceive, it's a complicated phenomena. The central nervous system, perception of time in the brain is highly distributed. We use a lot of our brain to understand how time is passing. And perception of time, some of the areas we think about are cerebellum, cerebrum, basal ganglia, and those are all areas of, significant differences in autistic brains. Many autistic individuals report that they feel out of sync with themselves and their environments. And this is reported in ways involving peripheral and central nervous system. And in the autistic neurotype, there are also reports and descriptions of a noisiness, a neural noisiness that occurs bidirectionally. This neural flow of information that feels noisy going up, what is my body telling me? And noisy going down, what is my brain telling my body to do? Now, any challenges and differences in a child's self-synchrony, how am I attuned with my own body, can inhibit the depth, complexity, and breadth of praxis skills. And when we're thinking about spoken language, praxis is really important. Now, it's not just internal body, because we think about in training to others. If the rhythms of others are hard to interpret, then being able to acquire meaning for them might be interrupted. For children who have challenges in this self-synchrony and challenges in attuning to rhythms from others, the sensory characteristics of what they're experiencing in their life might fail to match up. There's this uncoupling of action, intention, emotion, sight, sound, touch, and motion. And for autistic kids and adults, it might lead to challenges with feeling integrated with others, but also from the internal sensations and motor experiences within their own bodies. Now, often these motor differences might go unnoticed or unsupported. Their team might be focusing so much on language that they're not looking at integration of the rest of the body, perception of signals, or the subtle praxis differences. And so when we're looking at the difference of typically developing bodies, especially autistic bodies, in TD bodies, motor skills and abilities become increasingly intentional and goal-directed over time. We see this progression. That's what those milestone lists refer to. But for autistic children, there's often a reduced amount of predictable movement patterns. There can be this developmental cascade where if one crucial step for this skill on the milestone is either missed or has a lower level of flexibility or quality, there's this developmental cascade that might impact future motor skill acquisition, again, including spoken language. This may be because the autistic body and brain, they're not receiving clear feedback about goals, intentions, and outcomes because there's noisiness. Very often, this can be traced to an autistic individual's delicately balanced sensory motor system. Think about the clients you have where you see this delicate balance, where an experience that you might perceive as small sets them over the edge of regulation and has a big impact on their body. It might be something that doesn't impact your nervous system, but for them, the interpretation of that signal was really uncomfortable or scary. We think about stress. Stress actually has a big impact on rhythmic processing, because if sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are activated by stress, again, by things that may feel really small or inconsequential to you, the processing of timing and the cognitive resources related to that are probably going to be reallocated to fight or flight. And so in bodies where signaling and neural flow is not typical, there really isn't a strong complementary balance to get back to regulation. You might have clients where their dysregulation, their really hard experiences goes for a long time because the flow of information between sympathetic and parasympathetic doesn't have that efficiency and flow that helps that child come back down and get regulated or co-regulated. There's this imbalance of arousal and inhibition. Their bodies experience unintentional, unanticipated movements and sensations. And so this is important to think about when we're working with our clients is, how can I use rhythm to support helping this child stay at a point of regulation, but also understanding the different rhythms in these children to be able to explain to parents and other providers why this child might be having a really hard experience or experiencing a high level of stress that goes longer than anticipated, which I put in quotes. So what I want to share about next is this idea briefly of binding windows. So right now, all of us are taking in the world. You guys are watching this presentation or listening to this podcast. I'm presenting this information, and we're all creating binding windows to package together what we're learning. Whether I'm paying attention to this binding window if I'm sitting in a chair, I am speaking about this topic, I'm listening to the air conditioner, I look at my water bottle, all of this is packaged together in a binding window. It's where information from different sensory modalities occur closely enough in time for the body to connect it to the same event. Here's something so interesting. For autistic individuals, their binding window is twice as long than neurotypical individuals. On average, the autistic binding window was 600 milliseconds, and a neurotypical binding window was 300 seconds. And these numbers might seem seemingly small, but it presents a huge difference at the neurological level. This wider window may inhibit or prevent all the multisensory experiences from binding into a single, well-integrated perception of what's going on around them. So the visual input, auditory, proprio, vestibular, tactile, those all wouldn't match up very smoothly and might be harder to make sense of the environment. So for example, or to add on to that, unrelated events might be perceived as connected, while aspects of the same event might be experienced without precise timing that creates meaning, or the meaning that we perceive as neurotypical individuals. One example that relates to our field is that for an autistic individual, the speech sounds they're hearing might not perfectly line up with the facial movements they're seeing. Those aren't able to create a nice package of meaning in that wider binding window. So when you consider these binding window differences, autistic individuals may be working really, really hard for coherence. They may be trying to develop grander connections to understand the world. And if you're learning about Gestalt language processing, or that's something that you are supporting in the kids who align with the framework of GLP, we think about developing grander connections of meaning. A child may acquire an entire movie script as a Gestalt. They are trying to create coherence in the world, and this movie is a clear unit of meaning to them. And another way to consider this binding window difference, because we're thinking about the passage of time, is the way that many autistic individuals play with one or two modalities at a time with deep focus. So for example, lining things up or dropping something again and again. This strategy or preference is actually pretty adaptive, considering the challenges this child might have with the perception of time. they're actually adaptively reducing the amount of input that enters their window to make more sense of the world. Now, for neurodivergent children who experience mistiming, incoming information, like perhaps the phrases we're modeling or the skills we're trying to build, they might not seem like they're streams of information that are related or coupled to them. We might take for granted that the packages of meaning we're presenting are packages. This may lead to them not integrating incoming data and extracting meaning from it from the environment. And if they're not extracting what we're providing, reciprocity is going to be challenging. And so what I do want to share again is that this idea of the way that autistic children play and experience rhythm, for example, dropping something over and over again, or waving a hand in front of a face at an interesting rhythm, these are actually pretty intelligent and adaptive strategies. It helps them make more sense of an unpredictable, out of sync world. And in the absence of this reliable sense of movement, this reliable sense of what my body is experiencing through space and time, repeated patterns act as a frame of reference. And that's my argument that we can use rhythm and music to create repeated, reliable patterns of linguistic meaning. So the next paper is by Gran, 2012, and this is Neural Mechanisms of Rhythm Perception. So how does the brain process timing within rhythm? So when we think down to the level of the neuron, and that's how I like to get that zoomed in when I'm thinking about these clients I love so much. So neural groups in the brain, there's interactions between inhibitory neural groups, they say stop, and excitatory neural groups, they say go. And what happens between them is as they switch on and off, we create neural oscillations. Oscillations are indicators of neural communication that happens during information processing. Different parts of the brain, they oscillate with different rhythms. When we listen to music or other rhythmic input, it's so cool. The oscillatory periods in some parts of our brain, they entrain to the rhythm. It's not just your toes tapping. It's not just your head nodding. Your neural populations related to this skill are oscillating to that rhythm. So down to the neuron. Now, although the rhythmic stimuli, they have the power to entrain these neuronal groups, something even cooler happens, which speaks to the impact we can have. These entrained neuronal groups, they actually continue to oscillate at that musical rhythm or interval, even after that stimulus has stopped, which suggests that there's a memory of the interval. So it's another reason why I think it could be really powerful, and for my clients, has been really powerful when we present linguistic meaning within the elements and the structure of music. We're actually helping some neuronal groups entrain to it, and that entrainment continues even after the singing stops or the rhythmic speech stops. Now, when we're thinking about rhythmic cognition, I want to share some ideas around the idea of what I just said, which is creating or using the structure of music to embed linguistic meaning. In musical rhythm, there's something called a downbeat, like 1, 2, 3, 4, boom. It's that downbeat that starts things. A downbeat provides this initial signal that eases someone's interpretation of what's coming next. So one of the things I love to do with autistic clients is provide them a downbeat in my own speech, and also with predictable stress patterns. My claim is that this might be able to help the kids interpret the rest of the segment that I'm going to say. I don't necessarily just hit them with a string of language. Oh, look at that. I might give a downbeat right before to help their brain predict. So look at that. Boom, da da da. Or I might even give 4 beats. I might tap 4 beats. And so much of Western music theory is based on groups of 4. And a lot of autistic kids, particularly Gestalt processors, they pick up on that really quick, the grouping, the mathematical groupings of 4. So I might do, look at that. I gave 4 beats. It might ease them into it and give them the structure for what might be coming next. We think about prosody a lot when we're working with autistic kids because they are so drawn to musicality. Some of them have musical skills beyond any adult we know. And prosody provides phonologically rich information, as well as the stress patterns. And stress patterns, we actually see that the correlate in music is rhythm. And so when we're thinking about how the rhythm of speech differs from the rhythm of music, musical rhythm is much more predictable. The rhythm of speech changes. There's so many updates that a child has to do when they're processing spoken input. But if we put it into a rhythm, it might be more predictable. Or if we put it into a rhythm, it might be more predictable. If we put it into a rhythm, it might be more predictable. You see how I can say the same exact thing, but there's less predictability because you don't know where I'm going to go with the rhythm of my speech. But with the mathematics of music, it might all fit together. The next one I want to share is that, pulling from Hardy and Lagasse in 2013 article, autistic kids often demonstrate latency in movement events. They depend a lot on proprioceptive feedback to maintain postural stability and be regulated. Think about that client of yours that is on the go. With cerebellar differences and differences in stretch receptors and the parts of the brain that control motor input, integration and response to proprioceptive feedback may be more challenging. They need a lot more or a lot less than some of your other clients. Something interesting I want you to take away from this is that auditory feedback can actually help with proprioceptive muscular control and input. And rhythmic auditory stimuli, like holding a beat when you talk or playing a song in the background, it creates this feed-forward interaction. And so the auditory information kind of helps put the motor choices or the praxis into a clearer package of where to go next. There's more predictability in it. And so we can think about auditory rhythmic input as a support for proprioceptive muscular control. Musical input could be seen as an accommodation. It facilitates more efficient and fluid movement without as much reliance on proprioceptive feedback, which could be great for spoken language. With that auditory input of the rhythm, it might be easier to engage in the motor output of spoken language. Now, interestingly, internal pacing of movement, that is what the child has to come up with on their own, has much higher demands on an individual's motor system than external pacing. So if we're expecting a child or asking a child to internally pace their own speech and spoken language, that's a lot more work on them than if we provide an external pace for them to try and communicate along to. So now I want to shift into the biggest area of how to bring rhythm into your sessions. You may be doing this in certain ways. In terms of one of the phrases that a lot of people use is contingent imitation, reciprocal imitation. I'd love to share a deeper, more rhythmically informed approach. And I want to pull from the music therapy research. That is a place I go to for so much information about the neurological experiences and what they're seeing at the brain level and the behavioral level when it comes to rhythmic input, which is a modality I highly recommend experimenting with in your speech and language process. So this one is all about mirroring and rhythm-based interventions. So mirroring is when you imitate the exact shape, form, movement qualities, and even the feeling of another's actions. Mirroring techniques, they form a connection between a therapist and an autistic child through meaningful imitation skills. Now you may be saying, cool, my client doesn't imitate me. And that is where a lot of our clients start. What I'm going to talk about next is the importance of our role to imitate them for as long as they need to build those foundational skills. Through fidelity of imitation for the children we're working with, we can actually help build their imitation pathways to then imitate us. So they looked at 11 studies, a systematic review, and all 11 of them spoke to mirroring autistic children using rhythm helps with social communication goals, which was exciting to see. All of them have different levels of efficacy, but it was exciting to see that across all of these studies, they were seeing that mirroring and rhythm had an impact. So what does mirroring a child look like in your sessions? So here is what I want you to think about when it comes to your entrainment and rhythmic modeling toolbox. Here are some things that I've done with clients that help them feel more in tune with me by me attuning and entraining to them. One is I'll tap my hand or tap my foot while I model something. That gives the steady backbeat to what I'm saying. So I tap my hand or my foot. Some of the kids I work with, they like when I snap. So I might snap in the background and model something like, let's get some water. The snapping kind of provides the bookends around that spoken meaning. You might also change the way that you pace your gestures. You might be a big gesture while your client does small ones or small movements. Can you shift the way you move your hands to match how lateral or how distal or proximal they're going with their hand movements? I also recommend moving therapy materials, whether a swing or a small car, to a steady rhythm that matches the rhythm of the child you're working with. For example, if they're moving a car back and forth like this, I would watch and see what the motion is. Then I would join them at the same tempo. If a child's playing with a car, and so many of our clients love cars and wheels, and they're doing this, I wouldn't come in with my own car and go, vroom, 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 especially if they're not speaking or they're an early communicator. I would want to come in and mirror the tempo that they're at. Because for me, it's not about the way they're playing with the car. It's about how can I connect with you while you're enjoying this thing that you love. I might also play an instrument to the rhythm of a child's actions. Now, you may not be a musician. You can really use anything as an instrument, even just tapping on your knees. So if a child you're working with is engaging in some sort of stimming, let's say they're waving a hand in front of the face or tapping on the wall, I might tap at the very same rhythm as them, like on a drum or even on a guitar, or a shaker egg. What I'd want to do is mirror the rhythm of their body movements so that there's some temporal entrainment between us. The next one you might not have heard before. I recommend, especially for kids who are really sensitive, try breathing at the same tempo as the child. I know it sounds wild, but for the kids I've worked with who are so sensitive to input and me coming near them is really scary, I might start on the other side of the room and breathe at the same tempo as them. And that has been an opening for us to get more connected and build more proximity. I might mirror them by walking or running at the same rhythm or tempo as the child. If they are doing laps, I don't know if you guys have clients who like to run circuits. I'm not just going to run after them or run with them. I'm going to try and match the tempo of their feet moving. I might move toys or objects to a rhythm as well. We're thinking about like movement of that car, trying to, and this is not imitating them necessarily with it, but if you're bringing in an extra item or a separate item, can you also move those to a rhythm? The next one I would have in my toolbox is, can I put new words or phrases into song rhythms that that child loves? Let's say you have a Wheels on the Bus kid and you're so sick of singing Wheels on the Bus back to them or singing them with it. A rhythmic technique that you might use is to use that same exact rhythm, but can you plug in other words? That allows for that lyrical structure to be the vehicle where new meaning gets to plug in. The water on my hands goes splash, splash, splash. That way, you're activating the reward centers, the excitement and emotion of this favorite song, but you're offering and layering on contextual meaning because you might be in the bathroom washing your hands. Another one I'd recommend is noticing the rhythm in a child's stimming and join in with them. You might not be drumming along with them, but trying and join in on their stems and their vocal stems and doing it as they do it. For some clients, this doesn't feel comfortable. They might need to stim on their own to feel regulated and good. But for clients who seem comfortable with it, and if their parents are comfortable or caregivers are comfortable, I like to join in that stimming too, so we can temporally entrain to one another. Here's one I find really important when it comes to entraining through play, is to copy their play actions, but, and here's a phrase I like to share with families, separate but similar items. So if a child is playing with all of their dinosaurs and lining them up, if I try and join in with those dinosaurs, it's probably not going to go very well. If I try and join in with another set of dinosaurs, it also might not work out because that child might think, no, I need those too. I like to find items that are separate but similar. So I might find other animals that have 4 legs. I might just find different sizes of blocks that kind of speak to the isomorph of a dinosaur, but don't encroach upon that child's cognitive gestalt of what they're doing. Another one you might experiment with is playing a metronome or an instrumental piece in the background of your sessions. Sometimes by having a steady beat in the background, you and that child can entrain to it as this third party and feel more connected. As a bonus recommendation, the type of music I found this to be most successful with is actually reggaeton. Reggaeton has this level of syncopation where people feel really connected, and that's where I've connected with a lot of my clients. So try it out. Another one is I would match my posture or my vertical level to match the child. I'm going to show you examples of that in our example clips so that you have a better understanding of what changing posture and vertical level looks like. The last one in the toolbox, I think, can be the most important. If you kind of feel stuck with a client or you feel like you had a good flow and now things just feel different, pull back. Pull back, assess what those child's natural rhythms are. How are they speaking? What are the rhythms of speech? Are they moving to a certain rhythm or tempo? Are they fast movers, slow movers? Are they playing with a certain rhythm, tapping? All these natural rhythms of theirs can be best seen when you're not engaging with them. You might need to reconnect at the rhythmic level before you proceed with the higher level input you're trying to provide. I also wanted to share a checklist, the mirroring checklist. Some of these might be harder than others, but this is something I like to do as a checklist, especially with a new client or a client who might feel really challenging for me to work with. And often the clients who feel really challenging are the ones that I need to do some better entrainment with. First, am I mirroring their posture? Am I mirroring their vertical level? Am I above them? Am I below them? Am I mirroring their head position, like a tilt, or looking down or looking up at something? Could I mirror their breathing tempo? Am I mirroring their level of energy? Now, if you're working with a child for some co-regulation, or if you're informed by floor time practices, you might go a little bit above or below them, but we don't want to have wildly different affect and energy levels. Am I mirroring the child's vocalizations with fidelity? If they say digga 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 digga, and I say digga 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 digga, the fidelity is not quite there. Am I mirroring their intentional focus? I might be really focused on this cool toy I just got, but if their intentional focus is that same toy from every other time, I want to entrain to that. I want to mirror them with that toy. Am I mirroring gestures or hand movements? Am I mirroring their play choices with separate but similar items? And this one is a little more subjective. Am I, to the best of my ability, connecting to what this child is trying to learn or investigate through play? The play might not be the type of play that their IEP is looking for, their IFSP is looking for, that the caregivers are looking for. But by joining in on the play that they're already doing and finding the rhythms there, that builds the foundation. That's that bottom up work that I recommend rather than top down processing. And here's one that is really hard for a lot of clinicians. I know a lot of type A people tend to go into this field, people who are thinking about analysis, future planning. With kids like this, ask yourself, am I actually experiencing the present moment with this kid, or am I overly focused on the plan, their goals, or something else? Being really present with the rhythms of this child's movement, speech, singing is the best way to stay entrained to them. It's hard to be entrained to someone if you're not fully present with them. So let's see some examples in action. I want you to think about some of these ideas for entraining or mirroring a child. You're going to be looking at a bunch of my clients who happen to be autistic, and all of them, we also consider them to be Gestalt language processors. On the right will be the video clip. On the left will be some information about how I tried to entrain with them in the moment to build skills and stay connected.
Put it back. I fixed it. Put it back. Put it back, Corinne. Take it out. Uh-oh. Take it out. Put it back. Back. Put it back.
All right, so let's pause there. Things I mirrored. Posture, that leaning forward. I changed my vertical level by sitting on a lower step, so we were face to face. I wasn't above him. I mirrored his pitch range and vocal stimming. The way I was using my voice is very different than you hear now. This child spoke up here a lot, and he had a lot of tension back here. So I did those things. I mirrored the way he was examining these sponge letters. We had a lot of trust at this point to share the same objects, but when I first met him, I had to be across the room with separate but similar for like a month. I used slow tempo, steady rhythms. Put it back. Put it back. I tried to balance the turns we were taking back and forth. I took too many turns. I was talking too much. I was just so excited in this moment of the reciprocity we're having. And we were affectively entrained. We were laughing, we were smiling. And from this interaction, he acquired, and from the longer session, he got new gestalts, he got new mitigations, and he got plenty of new isolations. From this brief interaction, he used those for the rest of the summer because of this one interaction where we felt really connected. All right, let's look at the next one. Shaya. Shaya. Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
All right, let's pause that there. So you couldn't see me, but I was mirroring her posture. I was mirroring her vertical level by laying on my stomach. She's quite little. I mirrored her pitch range and vocal stimming. Again, my timbre was really different than my normal speaking voice, but she loves voices up here. I gave that steady, predictable rhythm with one of her special interests. And I actually had a visual of the rhythm I was modeling. And you saw she swayed to my beat with her body. And then she started tapping. And these were things we had never seen before. She's one of those kids who's all over the place. You can see there's a disconnect between brain and body going on. And in this, we were so connected, and she was in training to my rhythm. And again. Let's go! Running in a circle. Running in a circle. Spinning in a circle. And I stop. So for this child, and we had permission to show his face in this, his mom wants everyone to know about how to use music in speech therapy. So I mirrored his vertical level by crouching down. I can't play the guitar and run in a circle down at his level. I mirrored his timbre for oh. And I was trying to get that circular motion that he was craving. I changed my tempo to match his high energy level. And then I used that intro cue. We talked about giving a downbeat. So I did, I am spinning in a circle. So I gave that cue. I also tapped my guitar 3 times before I sang 1, 2, 3, before my, sung input came out. And what that does is it cues him to let him know something meaningful is probably coming.
You got eyes.
Yeah, you got eyes. Now we have 5.
There's the panda.
This is the panda.
You got
Now I see you.
So you see that sweet moment at the end of like deep connection. And so that affective entrainment we experienced at the end was also, we had a lot of trust, but my claim is that because of the temporal entrainment we were doing before, what he did, they got eyes, and I imitated that tempo. And then I gave him a novel rhythm. Now we have 5. And then he uttered, this is a panda. Now this. We had a really nice connection over that. And the affective entrainment, you can see we are feeling really connected at the end. All right, last one.
Let's go low. I know that's your favorite.
So he was tapping on this drum, tap, 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 tap. So I then modeled something at that same tempo. Let's go low. So I was joining in with something he produced motorically. I joined in with meaning that might match up with what he wants to learn about. And you can't see because his face is covered, but he turned to me with the biggest grin on his face and leaned forward to me because there might have been a matchup in his binding window that made sense to him. All right, so some reflection questions to think about. 1, what surprises you about entrainment? 2, what's one thing you will definitely take with you from this podcast episode? Number 3, which client were you thinking about during this episode and why? And number 4, what is one question you wish you could have answered about rhythmic entrainment? If you want to learn more about how to bring music theory into your practice as a speech language pathologist, come connect with me. You can find me at crescendocommunication.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at crescendo.communication. Now, please stay on after the call so that you can watch a live video on how to complete this course to make sure you get the credit for the hard work that you've put in. And now, for those of you, we are at the hour. If you do need to hop off, no worries. But if anyone would like to stay on and ask a question, we can go in until about, I could stay until about 9:10. 5 minutes? All right, let's do until 9:05. So we did have a question that said, for the child who began to trust you and show reciprocity, can you talk about the new gestalts and the way that he used them for the summer? Yeah, absolutely. So that client, we did a lot of trust building outside because he had lots of room to run and move. And as our sessions continued, we got closer and closer to each other in terms of proximity. One of the gestalts he acquired from them of that was put it back. You heard him kind of imitate that last part, back. For the rest of the summer, he started to then generalize it to other instances of putting it back. So for that, we were trying to fix this sponge letter P that had broken. Initially, when it broke, he lost his mind. He was so upset. But then when I applied this, silly phrase with like, put it back, it completely changed the way he felt about it. Now it was game. He started to say that when he was putting his backpack on the hook. He started to say it when they're trying to help him put food in the microwave. When he put it into the microwave, put it back. So that was an example of how from that moment of really being entrained and helping him be like, okay, putting it in, this is what put it back means. He was then able to engage in that generalization of other instances of small item, big item. It was really cool, or container. The next one was, can you give an example of a missed motor experience? Yes, absolutely. So an example of a missed motor experience might be skipping or not being able to do like a high quality rollover or reaching across midline. Some kids who skip crawling or who do kind of like that one leg goes, one leg drags. Some of those can have a developmental cascade. But we also think about kids who don't experience babbling early on, who show those early signs of practice difficulties. That can also have a cascade. You might have a 5-year-old who they didn't babble, and now you've got some of those foundational motor speech skills that need support. And then, yes, any way to get presentation of a PDF? Absolutely. So I'll provide that to speechtherapypd.com so they can send it out to everyone who is part of this call, as well as attach it to what will be the online course version. Madeline, you had a great question. What about your clients who cannot stand when you sing songs? Absolutely. So actually the rhythmic entrainment, this research and this set of tools was developed for those kids on my caseload. And those kids, honestly, they very often have perfect pitch because of the brainstem differences that they have. And for those kids, I do rely on more rhythmic speech, kind of a chant. And so I use that rhythm underneath. And I might speak like this. So example, look at that car, rather than look at that car, which I might do for other kids who love melody. And even if you feel like you're like, I don't have a good sense of rhythm, maybe put on like a background metronome or maybe even like a reggaeton beat. I'm telling you, try out reggaeton with your clients. There's something about it. And try and model on top of it. So if you're hearing boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, let's go. And if it fits right into it, it might tap into the musical networks, which can then partially recycle into the language networks of the brain. Yeah, I would say don't try and push singing to them if they don't like it. We don't want them to become averse to being offered language models. Erin, currently conducting research. Yeah, so I'm doing longitudinal research with my clients. All the families have agreed to participate. Some clients I've had for 4 years now. So I've been collecting their acquisition of language and the impact of certain music theory elements on their acquisition. And then I am applying for my PhD, hopefully to start next fall. Thanks for asking. And that comes, oh, thank you. You guys have sent such sweet messages. Thank you so much. Great. That brings us to the end of the call. We are launching Gestalt Get Together, the full speechtherapyp.com. So please follow along so that you can learn more and more about how to use music to support these clients. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's podcast. Remember to go to speechtherapypd.com to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs. We want you to get credit for the hard work you've put in to further your education. We also appreciate your support. We'd love for you to write a quick review of the podcast and subscribe. If you're listening on a streaming platform, feel free to rate us. 5 stars is great, 4 stars is awesome, but we also appreciate honesty around here if it's lower. That way, your ratings and your reviews will help get our podcast to more clinicians like you, as well as parents and people from other professions who might benefit from learning about Gestalt language processing. Now, if you've indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA for you. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. And also, please don't hesitate to tell us which topics you would like us to cover in future episodes. To get in touch, drop us a line in the comments section or send us a message on social media. We'd love to hear who you want us to interview, what topics are on your mind, and where you'd like us to investigate when it comes to the world of GLP. Okay, but here's the really cool part, especially because you listened all the way to the end. For For our Gestalt Get Together listeners, we actually have a special coupon code to receive $20 off any annual subscription to speechtherapypd.com. Head over there to get ASHA CEUs for listening to this podcast and all other episodes. My code is Gestalt20. You're going to put Gestalt in all caps, and that is GESTALT 20. I hope to see you at our next episode.